So picture this. It's 1798, and a grieving husband sits down to write this really loving but brutally honest tribute to his wife, who had just passed away.
Right, and he genuinely thinks he's immortalizing her, like cementing her as one of the greatest philosophers of the 18th century.
Exactly. He wanted the world to see her complete, authentic self. But instead, he accidentally destroys her legacy. He turns her name into this toxic, scandalous punchline for, the next 100 years.
Yeah, it's honestly the ultimate historical cautionary tale of oversharing. I mean, he practically handed society the exact ammunition they needed to cancel a woman who was already threatening the entire social order.
Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're joining us, we are taking a really close look at the life and work of Mary Wollstonecraft. And if you know the name, you probably know the big, heavy titles attached to it.
Right, like the mother of feminism or the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman.
Or, honestly, just Mary Shelley's mother. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because if you really want to understand her, you have to look past that sanitized marble bust of the great thinker.
You really do, because she wasn't just sitting in a quiet room theorizing.
No, not at all. We're looking at a woman who lived her philosophy out loud. I mean, navigating political revolutions, surviving devastating heartbreak, fighting for intellectual survival.
And doing all of that in a world that literally demanded her silence. The 18th century world she was fighting against was entirely defined by rigid inequality.
Yeah, we have to establish that context for you listening, because as a woman back then, your identity was essentially a legal fiction.
Exactly. You were the property of your father, and then upon marriage, your legal existence was effectively suspended and just absorbed into your husband's.
So to demand to be treated as a rational, independent mind in that environment, I mean,
Yeah.
It wasn't just progressive, it was a profound rebellion.
It was incredibly radical.
And to understand why she viewed that traditional social structure, not as this, romantic ideal, but as a literal trap, we have to look at her childhood. It was basically domestic warfare.
Yeah, she was born in Spitalfields, London in 1759, second of 7 children.
And her father started out with a pretty comfortable income, right?
He did, but he completely squandered it on these disastrous speculative farming projects. And as his financial power collapsed, he compensated by asserting his physical power.
Right. He was a violent alcoholic who regularly beat Mary's mother, which is just horrific.
It is, and that dynamic is so crucial to understanding Mary. She spent her teenage years literally sleeping on the landing outside her mother's bedroom door to protect her from his drunken rages.
Oh, wow. So she absorbed, at a completely visceral level, that economic dependence in a marriage could directly equate to physical danger.
Precisely. And because of that, she became this fiercely protective matriarch to her siblings, especially her sisters Everina and Eliza.
Which perfectly sets the stage for this deeply controversial, pivotal choice she makes in 1784. So her sister Eliza had recently married and given birth.
But she was suffering from a total psychological collapse, what we would totally recognize today as severe postpartum depression.
Right. And Mary observes this situation and decides the marriage itself is what's destroying her sister. So her solution is extreme. She orchestrates an escape.
Yeah, she literally persuades Eliza to flee the house and completely abandon her husband and her infant child.
And Mary hides her away until a legal separation is forced. But the fallout from that was swift and brutal, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. By leaving her husband and child, Eliza suffered total social excommunication. She couldn't legally remarry, so she was condemned to a life of poverty, just scraping by through grueling work.
The human cost was devastating. But I had to play devil's advocate here, though. Wait, so Mary's idea of a rescue mission was to convince a woman suffering from postpartum depression to abandon her baby and become a total social outcast.
Yeah, when you put it like that.
I mean, that sounds incredibly destructive. How is this a triumphant origin story for a philosopher?
Well, it is destructive, and it's certainly not a neat, triumphant narrative. But what's fascinating here is that it illustrates her absolute, uncompromising willingness to challenge ironclad social norms.
Right.
This wasn't an academic exercise for her. She watched her mother destroyed by submission, and she believed she was watching her sister lose her sanity in the exact same institution.
So she viewed the traditional structure of female dependence as basically a burning building.
Exactly. You don't politely unlock the door of a burning building. You shatter the window and drag the person out, even if they get cut on the glass. She prioritized psychological survival over social respectability.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
But without the safety net of a family or a marriage, Mary still had to survive economically. And the options for a poor but respectable woman back then were pretty bleak.
Very bleak. I mean, she tried being a lady's companion, which she found deeply humiliating.
She tried setting up a school in Newington Green, but that collapsed financially.
Yeah, and then she worked as a governess in Ireland for the ultra-wealthy Kingsborough family. And while she actually loved the children, she absolutely despised the subservience she had to show to their aristocratic mother.
Right, because those roles, governess, companions, they were essentially just different flavors of servitude. They required women to shrink themselves.
And she was so frustrated by that reality, so she decides to invent a completely new path. She actually writes to her sister, declaring she is going to become, quote, the first of a new genus.
I love that. The first of a new genus. Basically, she decides to become a professional female author. So she moves to London, sets up shop on Dolben Street, and teams up with a liberal publisher named Joseph Johnson.
She's incredibly driven. She learns French and German. She translates texts, writes reviews, and she just immerses herself in this circle of radical thinkers.
Right, dining with people like Thomas Paine and the philosopher William Godwin.
And it's in this intellectual crucible that she really hones her voice. She realizes she doesn't just want to write fiction or polite essays. She wants to dismantle the political philosophy of her time.
Which brings us to the works that cemented her legacy. First, in 1790, A Vindication of the Rights of Men, and then her 1792 masterpiece, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman.
Yes, the heavy hitters.
Now, to understand the explosive nature of these texts, we have to look at the political battlefield. Her first vindication was a direct, aggressive attack on conservative Whig MP Edmund Burke.
Right, because Burke had just published this famous defense of the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the traditional social order, all in response to the French Revolution.
And I should explicitly state here to you listening, our deep dive today is not endorsing either the left-wing radicalism or the right-wing conservatism of the 18th century. We are simply reporting the historical political context found in the source material.
Of course. And in that historical context, Burke's argument relied heavily on emotion and tradition. He used highly gendered language, essentially arguing that the state was like a vulnerable, beautiful woman.
Specifically Marie Antoinette, right?
Exactly. And that this vulnerable woman needed the chivalrous protection of the aristocracy. He associated beauty with feminine weakness and used that emotional imagery to drum up loyalty for the crown.
And Wollstonecraft saw right through that. She recognized exactly what he was doing, and she argued that politics must be rooted in cold, hard reason, not emotional manipulation and hereditary privilege.
Right. She was laying the groundwork for her next book, taking that demand for rational equality and turning it toward the condition of women.
Which leads to A Vindication of the Rights of Women, where she makes this foundational claim. Women are not naturally inferior to men. They only appear that way because society deliberately denies them an education.
Yes. It's an argument about systemic deprivation.
The source quotes this amazing part where she famously compared uneducated, pampered women to spaniels and toys roaming around a gilt cage, seeking only to adorn their prison.
It is a harsh metaphor, but she was calling out an educational system that taught women, needlework, basic piano, and superficial charm solely to catch a husband.
It's like trying to run a marathon while wearing a tightly laced corset.
Exactly. If the runner collapses, society says, look, she is naturally weak, she lacks the stamina. Wollstonecraft was pointing at the corset. She was saying, you have physically and intellectually bound women from childhood, and then you have the audacity to claim their weakness is the design of nature.
It's such a powerful way to frame it. But here's where it gets really interesting. The source points out she explicitly admitted in the text that men might have superior physical strength and valor based on the constitution of their bodies.
She did write that, yes.
And she didn't even use the word feminist. So, to modern ears, isn't that a massive contradiction for the supposed founder of feminist philosophy?
Well, we really have to calibrate our vocabulary to her era. The word feminist didn't even exist until the 1890s, a full century later.
Oh, wow, good point.
Yeah, and Wollstonecraft was not arguing for identical biological sameness. Her argument was theological and philosophical, that men and women are equal in the eyes of God.
Right.
She posed a brilliant question. If virtue has only one eternal standard, how can virtues differ between the sexes? You can't have one moral standard of truth and reason for men and a separate standard of submissive emotional manipulation for women.
Okay, that makes total sense. So, having mapped out the architecture of radical equality on paper, she doesn't just stay at her desk in London. She decides she needs to witness the birth of a society based on reason.
She does. She packs her bags.
Yeah, in December 1792, she heads straight into the epicenter of global upheaval, Paris, France.
And she arrives right on the precipice of the Reign of Terror. The timing is almost unbelievably dangerous.
I mean, she gets there about a month before King Louis XVI is guillotined. She actually watches him being escorted to his trial from her window and weeps at the sight.
It's just incredible to imagine her there.
And soon, France goes to war with Britain. Suddenly, Mary is an enemy alien in a country descending into absolute paranoia. The Jacobins seize control, and the daily reality becomes this nightmare of surveillance.
Right. Friends disappearing to the guillotine, forced public displays of loyalty to the Republic. It was terrifying.
And amidst this atmosphere of constant, terrifying violence, she seeks a lifeline. She meets Gilbert Imlay.
Ah, yes, Gilbert Imlay.
He's an American adventurer.
Yeah.
And Mary, who just wrote a whole book explicitly warning women not to be ruled by their passions, falls completely recklessly in love with him. They sleep together out of wedlock.
And to protect her from being imprisoned by the Jacobins, Imlay registers her as his wife at the U.S. Embassy, which grants her American citizenship.
Right, but while Mary is pregnant and navigating a literal revolution, Imlay is busy chartering ships to run the British blockade. He's smuggling food and soap into France and selling it at an exorbitant premium.
He was straight up a wartime profiteer.
He's the 18th century equivalent of a sleazy finance bro. He is capitalizing on the blockade while she is having his baby, Fanny, in a foreign, war-torn country.
And eventually, the profiteer loses interest. He leaves her in Paris, goes back to London, and starts a relationship with another woman.
Which is just devastating. When Mary finally returns to London and realizes the extent of his betrayal, she completely shatters. She attempts suicide twice.
The second time is chillingly methodical.
Yeah, the source details this. She walks up and down in the rain for half an hour to ensure her clothes are heavy with water, then jumps off a bridge into the freezing River Thames.
She is only saved because a passing boatman spots her and pulls her out unconscious. She later wrote that she viewed that suicide attempt as a deeply rational act, a fixed determination. The pain was just absolute.
But I struggle with this, though. She wrote an entire treatise telling women not to be the prey of their senses, right? Warning that being blown about by every gust of feeling destroys a woman's capacity for reason.
Right, that was a core part of her philosophy.
Then she completely loses herself over a guy who is blatantly ignoring her, and she jumps in a river. Doesn't her agonizing breakdown invalidate the very philosophy she championed?
It's the exact paradox that her critics have always seized upon. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the reality of her breakdown actually deepened her philosophical work.
How so?
Well, while in France, she was writing an historical and moral view of the French Revolution. In that work, she analyzed how the oppressive French monarchy, the ancient regime, conditioned women to use manipulation and charm.
Right, even Queen Marie Antoinette,
Okay.
because society valued their bodies over their intellects.
Exactly. Through her heartbreak with Imlay, Mary was realizing firsthand that this conditioning, this sensibility, wasn't just a bad habit you could turn off. It was physically deeply ingrained.
Oh, I see.
You cannot just flip a switch to pure, cold reason when society has spent decades programming your nervous system for emotional dependence.
Wow. So hitting absolute rock bottom in the waters of the Thames forced her to confront the agonizing gap between her rational theories and her messy human reality.
Yes, and she had to find a way to drag herself back to life, which led to one of the most bizarre business trips in history.
Seriously. To try and win Imlay back, she agrees to act as his legal proxy. She undertakes this incredibly grueling journey to Scandinavia.
She takes her baby daughter, Fanny, and a maid, and travels to Scandinavia to track down a Norwegian sea captain who had stolen a shipment of Imlay's silver.
Just picture the sheer grit of this. An unescorted single mother in 1795, traversing the rugged, isolated landscapes of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, conducting forensic accounting with hostile merchants.
It's wild, but what is truly brilliant is how she processed that experience. She turned that desperate errand into a wildly popular travel narrative, letters written in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark.
She basically writes a bestseller out of her heartbreak. The book weaves her melancholic reflections on nature with sharp critiques of commerce, which she clearly associates with the mercenary Imlay.
And returning to London, the success of the book helps her finally close the door on him. She re-enters the intellectual scene and rekindles her acquaintance with the philosopher William Godwin.
The same Godwin she'd clashed with at a dinner party years earlier.
Right. But he read her Scandinavian travel book and remarked that it was a book calculated to make a man fall in love with its author.
They developed this profound, deeply intellectual connection, and soon she is pregnant again, which forces a massive ideological collision.
A huge collision.
Wait, because Godwin literally wrote a famous philosophical treatise, Political Justice, advocating for the abolition of marriage, viewing it as an oppressive monopoly, and Mary was notoriously anti-patriarchal marriage.
Very anti-marriage.
So why on earth did these two famous rule-breaking radicals quietly go to a church in St. Pancras and tie the knot?
It was the ultimate pragmatic compromise. They knew exactly how punitive and cruel their society was. Mary had lived it.
Right, she saw her sister's ruin, and she had endured the immense stigma of raising Fanny as an unmarried mother.
Exactly. So they chose to sacrifice their public ideological purity to shield their unborn child from that brutal social ostracization.
But they managed the compromise brilliantly. They moved to Somerstown, but Godwin rents an apartment 20 doors down the street for his study.
They maintained completely separate living spaces, often communicating via notes delivered by servants. They designed a marriage that preserved their individual intellectual boundaries.
It was a profoundly modern arrangement. They found a way to be legally bound while remaining fiercely independent. It seemed Mary had finally engineered her perfectly balanced ending.
But the universe is rarely that neat.
No, it isn't. On August 30th, 1797, she gives birth to her second daughter, Mary, who, by the way, will grow up to write Frankenstein. The delivery initially seems fine, but the placenta fails to deliver completely.
An infection sets in. Childbed fever.
And 11 days later, Mary Wollstonecraft dies of sepsis at the age of 38.
Godwin was shattered. He wrote to a friend stating he firmly believed her equal did not exist in the world and that he would never know happiness again.
Which brings us back to where we started. Driven by grief and a desire to honor her complete humanity, Godwin publishes his memoirs of the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1798.
And he holds nothing back. He details her lack of religion, the out-of-wedlock child, the obsessive love for Imlay, and the suicide attempts.
And society reacted with vicious glee. The conservative press, already terrified by the radicalism of the French Revolution, weaponized her life story to discredit her political ideas.
She was literally labeled a hyena in petticoats. By presenting her unapologetically, Godwin handed the establishment the excuse it needed to bury her work.
So basically, Godwin overshared before the internet even existed and accidentally got his own late wife historically canceled.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And this raises an important question, right? It shows how society historically demands moral purity from female thinkers in a way it rarely does from men.
That is so true. For almost a century, she was historically canceled. Writers like Jane Austen subtly nodded to Mary's ideas in her novels, but Austen never dared print Mary's name.
It wasn't until the late 19th century that the suffragettes dared to exhume her legacy. Millicent Fawcett wrote an introduction to the centenary edition of Rights of Woman in 1892.
Claiming her as the intellectual foremother of the struggle for the vote.
Yeah.
But even today, how we remember her is fraught. Take the 2020 controversy over the commemorative sculpture in London by Maggie Hamblin.
Oh, the silver statue, yes.
Right, it featured a small, nude, symbolic female figure rising out of a silver mass. And critics were furious, arguing it diminished her by focusing on a stereotypical naked body rather than her formidable intellect.
It perfectly encapsulates the ongoing struggle to reconcile her brilliant mind with her physical, bodily reality.
But I'd ask you listening to reflect on this. How often do we let a person's messy personal life blind us to the brilliance of their ideas? The fact that we now read her life alongside her philosophy, embracing that messy human reality, it shows that the world is finally catching up to Mary.
The messiness wasn't a distraction from her genius, it was the crucible that forged it.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking for the real woman behind the heavy titles. And we found a thinker who clawed her way out of an abusive home, shattered the theoretical foundations of inequality, and stared down the French Revolution.
Chased a stolen silver shipment across the Scandinavian wilderness, and loved with a ferocity that almost killed her. She was exactly what she set out to be, the first of a new genus.
I'm going to leave you with a final thought to ponder. When Mary died at 38, her desk was covered with unfinished work. There was a fragment called Lessons, and most tantalizingly, a set of notes titled Hints Outlines, meant for a second volume of Gill, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman.
A second volume.
Right. Imagine for a moment if Mary hadn't died. Having finally found a stable, intellectually equal partnership with Godwin, what would that second volume have looked like?
It's fascinating to think about.
How might the agonizing heartbreak in Paris, her confrontation with her own deep-seated emotional conditioning, and her ultimate domestic happiness have reshaped her revolutionary theories? It's a ghost of a masterpiece, waiting in the margins of history for you to explore.